Hey folks, so we're doing the second section of chapter 2 here. Of chapter 5 from Black Skin, White Masks by Frantz Fanon. We ended last time with a sort of, barrage of concepts I said I would define. I'm sorry this lecture's taking me so long. You really gotta read this chapter on your own. And, I'm doing my best to sort of grab some concepts out of here and sort of make this chapter about a couple concrete things when, in fact, this chapter isn't really about a couple concrete things. It's about a million different things ambiguously, right? And, it's one of the reasons why I like to teach it, and I really like to teach it sort of in dialogue and in a class with you, ideally. But, you can't get what you want all the time. Certainly not when there's a pandemic. So, in lieu of that, I would just recommend, this is one of those chapters, and the reason why I love to teach this is because every time I read this chapter, this book in general, different themes stick out to me, and I feel like I learned something new about the same 20 some odd pages every time I read it, and I've done so a number of times. So this is just sort of my plea for you to try to I'm giving you some layups here, but really do try to work through this on your own, if you can, because I think it's really rewarding, and Fanon is also a beautiful writer, and uses that to his advantage. So I want to start out with these notions of recognition and the gaze of the other, which are not distinctive concepts to Fanon, right? He's really well read in French phenomenology, and is taking these concepts from the phenomenological tradition, certainly the way that he's using them. Recognition, it's hard to sort of, that's an everyday word, right? And it's important to understand that it does have a technical meaning, right? To recognize something is to sort of recognize, right? It's got the root of cognition in there, and the in the sense of repetition, right? To do again, which is to say, to recognize something is to see something as something, right? Or see someone as someone. Which might sound just sort of manifestly obvious, but, that is to say, we don't just experience the world as sort of splotches of colors and shapes and indistinguishable noises. It's not just sense data impinging on our sense organs, right? We recognize things, right? We tend to part of how we perceive the world, it's sort of modulated by this form of recognition, right? We can sort of recognize situations, when you walk into a room, for instance, you can tell if the mood is sort of jubilant or if it's glum, right? And it's not clear what specifically you're latching onto that gives you the impression that that's true, but you just sort of recognize it in the surroundings, right? You see or you perceive this room full of people as happy, or you perceive it as sad, right? And Recognition and being recognized are important parts of how this thing that we call a self is constituted, right? It's their recognition is important. The ways in which we are recognized by others are important parts of how we understand ourselves, right? And they're important parts of how we understand who we are, what sort of thing that we are, right? This is why it's nice to grow up in a nice environment where people are telling you, oh, you're so smart, or like, you're so strong, or whatever, right? In an environment where your accomplishments are recognized as accomplishments, right? It makes you feel good. It makes you feel confident, right? When the things that you do are recognized as such, and accordingly, to be recognized as bad or insignificant, that also gets under your skin too, right? As much as we might be inclined to think that we are somehow or other, our sense of self is impermeable to our social surroundings, it kind of isn't, right? In many ways, we do take ourselves to be the kind of thing that we find ourselves recognized as, right? Which might be true on a sort of like fundamental level, just like who you take yourself to be as a person, but it's also especially true of like institutional positions, right? I can go around calling myself the King of Starkville all day long, but if nobody recognizes me as the King of Starkville, right, that means it isn't real. If there were somehow or other some sort of like institution that recognized me as the King of Starkville, then yeah, maybe I have a claim to that. But if I just go around saying so and nobody recognizes me as that, then it means I'm not that, no matter how much I insist I am, right? And the sort of important baseline feature of social recognition, on a really sort of primordial level, is this notion of the gaze, right? And the gaze is a really important phenomenological concept, where the gaze refers to how it feels to be looked at, right? And how our experience of ourselves is modulated just by sort of being present to the gaze of the other, right? You certainly have had the experience at some point in your life where you were up to something and you didn't think anyone was looking at you, and then all of a sudden you realize that somebody was looking at you, and it changes your perception, right? Between moment A and moment B, you have a different conception of what you're up to. I mean, put it this way, right? The gaze is an important difference between what we call an other versus what we call a thing, right? Objects don't look back at me, right? They don't, I don't feel myself sort of present to another's field of perception when I'm looking at my coffee cup, right? It doesn't look back at me, whereas the other does, right? And yeah, it gets kind of fuzzy, right? Like, of course, on some level, animals have a gaze, right? But non-human animals have a gaze, but certainly not in the same way that our fellow humans do, right? This is the reason why we hate public speaking, right? This is why, you go up to give a presentation in front of the class, and all of a sudden you are like hyper aware of everything you're doing, right? Or when somebody's taking a picture of you and you forget what to do with your hands, right? You don't usually think of what you do with your hands until you know that this moment is somehow or other going to be reified in an image, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, what do I normally do with my hands, right? That's the sort of way in which the gaze of the other affects our perception of what we're up to, right? Right, it's the reason that we get embarrassed, right? Big example for me, and this is probably personal, right? Is the moment when you get caught by another driver like singing in your car, right? And you probably weren't even thinking about it. Then all of a sudden somebody's looking at you and you're embarrassed, right? The gaze of the other. It's sort of, it's not just a sort of look from without, right? Because it also changes something about your self-conception of the situation that you're now occupying, right? So, in addition to this, he talks about the body schema, and Fanon is introducing this concept of the racialized or epidural body schema, right? And he's getting this notion of the body schema largely from Merleau-Ponty, again, that guy that we were going to read, but, situations. The body schema describes how the body appears to us as the one who lives through this body, right? Suppose you're sitting at a desk right now, you can't see your legs, but you know where your legs are in space, right? You have sort of haptic feedback, you have proprioceptive feedback from your body, right? You can wiggle your toes without looking at them, right? You have this sort of pre-reflective sense of how your body moves, right? And how your body takes up space in the world, right? Even if you're kind of clumsy, right, you still are pretty good at navigating your body through space, right? And we also experience the world in terms of, how our body is able to sort of cope with space, right? We sort of, right, we have an immediate sense in any situation that we occupy, like what sort of things are in grasp versus not in grasp, which things are reachable, the flight of stairs, the objects and situations appear to us in terms of how our body can negotiate them, right? So the body schema, that's not a terribly clear explanation, but suffice to say, the body schema describes how the body for someone who lives a body is not just an object, right? It's something that you live through, and the thing in terms of which the world appears meaningful and negotiable, right? And Fanon is talking about the way in which this sort of pre-reflective body schema, or the way in which the body is given to us as a power for interacting with the world, is different from the position of occupying a black body within a white world, right? That is to say, occupying a body that is marked as somehow or other colonized, right? Against the background of the colonial world, right? That is to say, his position in relation to others sort of like manifest in his blackness, right? And he's describing the sense in which there's this body schema which is it's not just a body schema for him. It's a sort of way in which his appearance is already being sort of pre-interpreted by those around him, right? And the way in which to appear as black in the white world bears with it this sort of, as he puts it, I was responsible not only for my body, but also for my race and for my ancestors, right? The appearance of blackness within the white world carries this colonial history with it, right? He writes on page... Oh, sorry, I didn't put the page number. I think it's 95. Where he says, I'm not given a second chance. I'm overdetermined from the outside, and I'm a slave not to the idea that others have to me, but to my appearance, right? Where my appearance is already sort of marked as colonized. And he uses this word overdetermination to refer to the way in which to be a sort of historically colonized subject, right? To occupy the world with the sort of vestiges of colonialism manifest in your appearance to others. That is to say, the way in which he experiences his blackness against the background of the white world in France means that the colonized are not able to speak for themselves, or to sort of freely determine the meaning of their being in the world in the way that the colonizer can, right? To be overdetermined, as he puts it, is to have something speaking about you prior to having spoken about yourself, right? That is to say, the meaning of the encounter with the other already has a meaning built into it that neither party has chosen, right? And this, he's got myriad situations throughout this chapter where he's describing exactly this, right? Where the meaning of his appearance on the bus or at the dinner party or in the public square already carries with it and is predicated on a colonial history which is overdetermining his being in the world in relation to this colonial past. So what he's describing here is a kind of racism. We tend to have a sort of insufficient understanding of what it means to be racist, and he's sort of pointing this out. We typically think that racism just means having negative feelings or feelings of ill will towards another race of people, right? And he's pointing out, look, this overdetermination that I'm describing and the way in which this sort of colonial history is sort of bearing down on me and my ability to sort of engage with others in the white world, and the way in which my meaning is overdetermined here. This can function in the context of either positive statements or negative statements, right? I mean, he's pointing to the way in which a compliment can be racist, right? Like something that isn't intended to hurt your feelings, right? Can still function in the service of overdetermination, right? And you see on page 94, he's, I won't read it out loud, but you can read it for yourself, right? The moment where the woman on the street says to him, look at how handsome that Negro is, right? And she thinks that she's being nice, right? Of course, we know, what's sort of implied when she says that is not just a compliment. She's also saying, she's almost kind of saying, like, it's interesting that he's handsome, right? Or that's distinctive, right? You see this compliment come up a lot, right, when white folks say to black folks, like, "Oh, you're very well spoken," right? Like, why shouldn't I be, right? People think that they're giving a compliment, but it's really sort of over determining who they think you are, right? And he's got a variety of these situations that he's describing encountered in daily life. Like, a lot of this chapter is phenomenological insofar as, like, he's not just giving to us philosophical concepts. He's trying to sort of, like, paint these tableaus of social situations in which these things appear, right? Because it's often difficult to sort of, like, put your thumb on. He's sort of describing the sort of passing appearances of this colonial overdetermination and the ways in which blackness is sort of an overdetermining force in white society, and it makes and the sort of, like, colonial gaze has a tendency to constitute blackness as an object, right? And it becomes a barrier to existential self-determination, right? I mean, Fanon's an existentialist, right? He wants to make use of his existential freedom, right? He is making use of his existential freedom, right? I mean, the guy's got, like, 2 degrees, and, he's a prolific writer, and he's got all these accomplishments, and is still finding himself at every corner sort of just bashing his head into this sort of blackness that precedes him in all of his interactions with others. And that's the sort of thing that he's describing in this chapter, right? That is, to be recognized as a colonial subject precedes and overdetermines all other forms of being that he's trying to achieve, right? He's not allowed to just be a playwright. He's always going to be a black playwright. He's not allowed to be a philosopher. He's a black philosopher, right? And that, whether you take pride in that or not, he's pointing to the fact that, like, look, that's true, but, you see how it's sort of speaking to, or sort of over-determining the meaning of what I'm up to, right? So it's hard to articulate all the things that are going on in this chapter, and that's sort of, in the broadest sense, the theme that's taking place. But really, I want to encourage you to read these things on your own, and really see what you can get out of this, because it's one of those things that ought to be read many times before its meaning unfolds, and I can only go so far in terms of articulating it, right, as the white guy myself, right, because these are not experiences I've had, right? I'm not telling you, right, what it's like to be black. All I can tell you is what Fanon is saying here, right? And in that spirit, I don't really want to try to say much about, on 119, these final 2 paragraphs of the chapter. I would encourage you to just take some time on your own to read them for yourself, and try to let that sink in a little